All right. Well, welcome everyone to IBIS's Environmental Justice Speaker Series. This week, it is my pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Michael Mascarenhas, who will be speaking with us today about racialized austerity and the Flint Water Crisis. Michael is an associate professor in the Department of Environmental Science, Policy, and Management at the University of California, Berkeley. He has written on water, wolves, seed saving, supermarkets, family farms, and forests. His work investigates interconnections between contemporary neoliberal forms, environmental change, and environmental justice and racism. So please, everyone, join me in welcoming Michael today.
Thank you. I really want to say a deep thanks for joining me today. It's difficult times. I think we're experiencing a really deep discord, division, and danger. And so, you being here and supporting me is important. And I really want to thank you for that. And thank the organizers for inviting me and providing some continuity in this tumult. I probably won't say too much about the election other than it's been a little disappointing. This is clearly not a repudiation of a white supremacist leader, and that has been disappointing. If you're like me, the last 4 years have been personally troubling, but we've also struggled and protested and written and organized, and to see this a real lack of any response or is disheartening. Perhaps I shouldn't be surprised, but nevertheless I am. The second thing I think I need to do is to really acknowledge where I am standing on Ohlone National lands at the University of California, Berkeley, and to recognize also that wherever we are on Turtle Island, that we are on native land, and that land has been stolen, and that is an enduring legacy that we need to not only understand but to deal with. Lastly, a plug. I was fortunate enough to have the generous responses from some good colleagues to my poorly put together email about putting together a book on environmental justice that connected the civil rights movement and the anti-toxins campaign to Black Lives Matter and Idle No More. And the book has a kind of deep pedagogical focus. There are small chapters written by a diverse set of scholars that provide, I think, accessible entry points to the field, and it's particularly kind of geared towards undergraduate students and people who are just sort of public intellects trying to understand what EJ is today. So, I do want to stick with or have us, as I introduce a few slides, this notion of thirsty, because I think it has some traction, not only sort of in its kind of explanatory force, but in symbolic meaning as well. And I want to start off by saying, water has fueled white racism since sort of the beginning of this empire. We can look at segregated public beaches and pools to separate drinking water fountains and toilets. Water has remained a potent symbol of white privilege, white supremacy, and it's been a persistent conduit for discrimination. Iroquois folks in sort of upstate New York and in Ontario and Quebec would often say, you locate the village where the water is, right? And that's I think a true analogy. Also, I think water's sort of symbolic association with purity and its kind of direct link to public health and illness, of course, has made it a powerful kind of biopolitical determinant in sort of delineating the conditions of how people live and survive. We often talk about the other sides of the tracks, right? Geographically, but we really acknowledge how water too divides kind of American society. You know, it's kind of interesting. You think back, you know, when the pools were forced to integrate during the New Deal, the pool operators, they argued against it, and what they did was they emptied the pools, they scrubbed them clean, and then they filled them with water after black children would swim in them. Then black people would get sort of one day to swim in them. Say Thursdays, the pool would drain Fridays, and the rest of the week, white folks could swim at it. Not so long ago. I also want to kind of think about water in terms of its weaponization. And in terms of the way water has protected the interests of the state and corporate power as well. And here are examples of high pressure hoses that were kind of used, that were turned on in Birmingham, Alabama, on black activists, right, who wouldn't go away quietly. And more recently, First Nations, Native Americans, and allies for water cannons were turned on them in the Dakota Access Pipeline protests. And lastly, I want to move to Flint. So in the spring, many of you know this now, in the spring of 2014, officials in the city switched their water from the Detroit Water and Sewer Department at that time to the Flint River. And this was an apparent effort to save money for the indebted city. Community members, right, majority black city, immediately reported that their water had changed color, that it was a strange odor. It actually was a strange odor before it changed color. Some residents suffered all sorts of things: skin rashes, hair losses. Animals would die during this time, early in the water poisoning. Others complained about back and muscle aches. Still others experienced kind of gut bacterial problems. And many caught the flu, which is kind of interesting as well. The county health department kind of refused to act, downplaying the danger. A spokesperson from the Michigan Department of Environmental Quality actually told them to relax. Right. Now we know now that due to government decisions, over 100,000 people drank water that had E. coli, had causing trilomethane, and lead, right? And they drank that for over 18 months. 100,000 people were intentionally poisoned, 9,000 children, 200 confirmed cases of lead poisoning, and 90 cases of Legionella disease, of which about 12 people died. Also, kind of given that Legionella bacterium causes fever and flu-like symptoms, right? The number of people that were actually infected probably were higher from Legionella disease. It's now been five years since I've been writing and studying and working with activists in this city and in Detroit as well. And I think we should know that people still don't have access to safe water in that city. You should also know, and here's an activist that I've been working with. Her name is Monica Lewis Patrick. She is one of 4 leaders and co-founders of the group We the People of Detroit. She's a human rights activist, and she has been formidable in sort of organizing the grassroots movement in Detroit and in Flint. But I invited her to give a talk when I was at RPI, and here she was talking to students, and she says, do you know that almost the same amount of people in Flint that drank poisoned water were also the same amount of people in Detroit that have had their water cut off. And she says, you're just as poisoned if you can't properly hydrate yourself as if you drunk contaminated water. Because after 5 days, usually you're not sticking around long enough to know what the end will be. Between 2014 and 2016, a 2-year period, the Detroit Water and Sewage Department shut off water to more than 80,000 homes and buildings in the city. That's amounting to about 200,000 Detroiters without water. Just to give you some perspective on that, Detroit has about 700,000 people. Water shutoffs have also been linked to hepatitis A outbreak in Detroit area, the largest in the country's history. In August of 2016, there were about 610 cases. of the disease reported in Michigan, including 20 deaths. Now, my work kind of focuses on the sort of environmental justice that's going on in terms of in Michigan, particularly in those two cities. But I also think it's important to recognize the kind of ways in which this is playing out across this country, right? So we know that this is going on in New Orleans. We know it's going on in another Black community in Washington, D.C., in Milwaukee. We know that this is a national problem, Chicago as well. In the state of California, more than 1 million people don't have access to safe and affordable drinking water. And a recent investigation published in June of 2018 found that at least 6 million Californians are served with water providers that have been in violation of state standards at one point or the other since 2012. A recent report out of University of Michigan argues that about 12% of the US population are living with water insecurity, and as much as 40% of people will not be able to afford their water in the next 5 to 10 years. So water access and affordability is a national problem in this country. It has particularities in certain cities, but there's something that we really need to address. So I want to turn my attention to sort of how the media and reports have sort of addressed or explained what has happened in Flint. And here I'm sort of thirsty for meaningful explanations. But the dominant narrative really has been one of neglect, most prominently. It's the dominant narrative really has been state agencies fail to treat the water. State agencies fail to inform the public. Consultants fail to provide the right advice to governments, and as a result of this neglect, people suffered. And the other sort of sub-narrative that comes out of here also is that Flint's problems and Detroit's problems were their own problems, right? And this is sort of the colorblind narrative that kind of undergirds some of this analysis that, what happened in Flint, why it was sort of insolvent, why Detroit went bankrupt, is really because of Black leadership, right? And the fact that people aren't paying their bills in Detroit and in Flint, this is a pathology of Black and brown households. It's not said, but there is this sort of subtle colorblindness to this analysis. What this sort of analysis does in terms of, in addition to kind of formulating this or pushing forward this kind of colorblind narrative, is that it reduces what happens in these towns to accidents, right? And by focusing on neglect, and that occurs at sort of every level. So here, the Flint Water Advisory Task Force, which is a task force that's actually put together by the governor after he finally admits that yes, we poisoned the city of Flint. And they write that the Flint Water Crisis is a story of government failure, intransigence, unpreparedness, delay, inaction, and environmental justice. But in effect, the report reduced Flint Water Crisis to a series of failures, a series of kind of unfortunate mistakes by individuals and the agencies with which they work. And from my experience in talking to people and working with community activists, in both those places, that's not what happened. I am sort of, there has been a lot written since in terms of how to explain what's going on in some of these towns, particularly Flint and Detroit. Paul Mohi has talked about what happened in Flint as an extreme form of environmental justice. Andrew Highsmith talks about this in terms of municipal fragmentation. Peter Hammer at Wayne State talks about this in terms of strategic racism. Laura Polito has called it racial capitalism. These are really, I think, have a lot of explanatory value in kind of thinking about what's going on in these places. What I find problematic with a lot of the stuff that's being written is the sort of passive nature with which these things are playing out. The passive nature in terms of how structural strategic racism actually works in these places. There's a particularity to some of these cases, or particularly to Flint and Detroit in particular, that's not getting captured in some of these analyses. So there's really a lack of historical context. There's really been a lack of kind of deep ethnographic analysis, really to explore the role of particular actors, groups, and networks. What I sort of call the micro-politics making of environmental justice in Michigan. And that's what I really want to kind of focus on in my work. I'm really interested in the elaborate networks, the roles of particular individuals, and the groups behind the veil. These are decisions that were made by particular actors. And I want to foreground, as Joe Fagan has said, whites' active and kind of determinative and continuing position as the racial oppressor and exploiters. And it's not that I want to show individual kind of intent, but I do want to show the ways in which the weak ties of certain people and their political positions have created these cases of environmental injustice in particular. So this analysis sort of directs a critical environmental justice perspective. It's carefully outlined by David Pellow's work towards a racialized state violence of urban austerity in Michigan. It's really, I think, a political ideology and a policy that is literally taking the country and kind of the world by storm. So it's not neglect I want to focus on, it's policy, right? I want to focus that this is what's going on in Flint and Detroit are not accidents of neglect, are not mistakes of individuals, they're policy. So the ethnography I'm trying to do here examines the degree to which multiple and intersecting forms of ethnic, racial, and gendered environmental injustice have been kind of under-theorized in matters concerning access to water, access to safe and kind of affordable water. And so, just give you a little bit of history about the work I've been doing. I and some graduate students started work in around 2016. So while people were suffering from the water, the contamination in Flint, we interviewed people both in Detroit and in Flint. We've conducted more interviews than I can count with individuals and groups, and examined lots of data. We participated in research projects. We've run workshops, information sessions as well. I provided expert testimony at the Michigan Department of Civil Rights meetings on the Flint Water Crisis, and along with Paul Mohai, actually. And just see some perspective as why I'm personally interested in this. I did my PhD at Michigan State. I finished it there in 2005. I'm from Southern Ontario, which is about 2 hours from Flint. I have friends who live in Flint. I have friends and family who live in Detroit. And so when we started to hear from our network about what was going on, I was not only kind of intellectually interested, I was personally involved. So what I have found quite interesting really is how this sort of form of environmental justice has become a kind of a racial formation. And what I find really interesting about austerity and urban austerity as well is it plays out very differently in different communities. It's arguably about balancing the books, but the more you look at what's going on in places like Flint and Detroit, the math doesn't add up. In spite of best efforts, people aren't balancing budgets. Or then certainly if they are balancing budgets, they're not dealing with deficits, which they say that's the only reason they're there. The other interesting piece around urban austerity is the way in which it has moved particular kinds of jurisprudence, particular types of laws in Flint, constitutional laws, challenge those laws around commitments to pensions, and benefits of employees in particular. What's really important to understand, I think, about urban austerity policies in Michigan is its removal of democracy at the local level, right? So it's using force to push through some of its policies. And the other important thing I want to point out in the book and this talk are kind of these intimate alliances of people who are connected, not just sort of politically and economically, but who are friends. So I'll give you an example. Governor Schneider and Kevin Orr. So Kevin Orr is the first emergency manager that's appointed for Detroit. Kevin Orr, Governor Schneider, or Rick Schneider, went to law school at the University of Michigan together. They know each other very well. They met at a snowball fight. Fun fact. And the same thing with Mike Duggan and Anthony Gidd, the new mayor of Detroit, the treasurer. All these folks kind of know each other, and they have deep, deep ties to each other as well. And I really want to focus on the kind of intimate alliances that people have, and sort of the handshakes and backdoor deals that are done. So one of the things I want to point out is again, what happens in what's happening in these cities is not a matter of neglect, it's a matter of policy. And one of the ways it gets justified is we're just adding up the numbers. So I want to kind of give you an example here of Governor Schneider speaking. This is before he made him governor, about what his policy is about. If I can get my cursor over there.
I'm an accountant and your governor. I found I can help more people when the numbers add up, when Michigan's foundation is solid. Michigan was once the engine that drove America, but we took it for granted. We didn't change with the times, and we let politics get in the way. Not anymore. We're on the road to recovery for every Michiganer. You might not feel it yet, but you will soon. We've eliminated $1 billion.
So I'm gonna pause it there. Let me see the whole thing. So a couple interesting points, I think. He's not a politician, he's a businessman, and he's gonna make the numbers add up. Now, you think you've heard this before at the national stage? You have. The other interesting thing is the ways in which he justifies adding up the numbers, right? We got behind with the times. We lacked creativity, we kind of got lazy. And this is the kind of subtle colorblind narrative that is used in Michigan. Right? And Michigan is, has a particularly kind of racial formation. And so this is an ode to kind of folks who want to discipline Black cities, particularly Detroit and Flint. And so he doesn't have to use race in his, of course he wouldn't, but there's a way in which this is like, I'm here just to add up the numbers, and we're going to discipline people who are misbehaving financially. So Rick Schneider becomes the 48th governor of Michigan in 2011. And, the recent malicious organizing, mobilization in Michigan is not inconsistent with the political kind of environment that goes on in that state. So I'm talking to someone who works at the school board here, and he says, Republicans took control of the legislature in 2010, took control of the House and the governor's office. They just swept in. And the other interesting thing I think you should know about Mr. Rick Schneider is that his financial disciplining of the city of Detroit was so well received that before Flint happened, but was so well received in revitalizing Detroit that he and his team, he had put a team together to look at his potential for a presidential campaign. So he was thinking of running as a business leader as well as the current president. It wasn't till the Flint Water Crisis came up that he canceled that. The money, the interesting piece here, the money that he put into this campaign to run for president, that money, that pact was then used to pay for some of his lawsuits that occurred in Flint. So this is the other interesting thing about, and kind of similarity here with the current president. He's not a real Republican. Right? His friends don't know him, right? Republican friends don't know him. He's a business leader from Michigan. His power base is universities, the Fortune 500, the Fords, the DeVosses. That's where it comes up. You know, the Macar Institute. That's where he comes from. That's who he represents. So in his first month of office, amongst other things, Rick Snyder eliminated Michigan's business tax and replaced it with a flat 6% corporate income tax on some 95,000 companies in the state. That amounted to a $2 billion tax cut in a city that was sort of reeling from the Great Recession and industrial turn down. You know, the way in which he frames it is really interesting too. So he brings in this $2 billion tax cut. And then he says, you know, we're getting rid of the special interest kinds of items, right? So we're just going to do this 1% tax cut. We're going to get rid of special interests. But who are the special interests? These special interests include children in K-12 schools, college students, welfare recipients, military veterans, people serving in prison sentences, and employees and clients for the Department of Health and Human Services. So people who are poor and majority people of color, right? So again, it's kind of this colorblind rhetoric. By simply making the numbers add up is really completely contradicted by the vulnerable communities that have been targeted for kind of financial disciplining by this kind of white businessman in arms, right? Engorged by such strokes of this sort of colorblind pen. You know, in 2011, Governor Snyder eliminated the statutory revenue sharing program. So statutory revenue sharing has been a long federal and state program, starts with Nixon at the federal level, before that in Michigan. And basically it's revenue sharing, it's the amount of taxes that is grossed at particular municipalities, particularly it's gas, tobacco, and alcohol. And in 2011, Governor Snyder eliminated that statutory revenue sharing altogether. And you can just think about a city like Flint or Detroit. It's just had the Great Recession, foreclosures and property taxes are down, and now you're taking, you know, millions of dollars from the budget. And that was effectively the sort of the straw that broke the camel's back and sent these cities and cities like these off the financial cliff. So the city of Detroit, for example, ranked #1 in this kind of long list of Michigan cities losing revenue sharing money. Between 2022 and 2012, excuse me, Motown lost $732 million from state cuts. That money could have prevented this major black city, which is about 80% black, from state takeover by emergency managers. It could have also prevented the largest municipal bankruptcy in U.S. history. Flint had $54.9 million taken from its budget over the same period. Flint's deficit in 2012 was $19.2 million. With revenue sharing dollars, Flint could have eliminated its deficit. It could have paid off all $30 million of bonded indebtedness that it had at the time. And it still would have had $5 million in surplus. It could have invested that in schools and transportation, police and fire, and sort of other critical services. The majority black city here, 54% black, wouldn't have been taken over by 4 different state appointed emergency managers. And the city would never have needed to switch its water from Detroit to Flint. Its residents wouldn't have needed to drink lead poisoned water. So these policies don't add up. But they become justified again through this deep kind of colorblind, subtle colorblind narrative. So, you know, here is Michael Lefebvre. He's a director for the Mackinac Center, right-wing think tank, sponsored by Betsy DeVos and her husband, the Koch brothers and others. And he frames, as soon as these policies start to come in, frames these policies as the cities who have depended on revenue sharing as ladling the gravy, right? So the accusation about kind of the reckless and self-indulgent character of mostly Black cities, right, in Michigan, these sort of struggling cities, it kind of helps justify these sorts of kind of egregious policies. The Mackinac Center has sort of recommended eliminating all statutory revenue sharing and personal property taxes for decades now. Received generous donations from the Koch brothers over the years. And just to give you some sense of revenue sharing, it's existed nationally since the program was first implemented under Nixon in '72. And its idea was to create a system by which the federal funds could be shared with sort of state and local governments to build city services like schools, hospitals, and police forces. And so this notion of ladling the gravy is really a kind of indictment of kind of Black leadership, right, in Michigan cities like Flint and Detroit, Benton Harbor as well. So just to give you a sense of how this gets done in these cities. So 2 months after Governor Schneider took office, he signed into law Public Act 4, which is called the Local Government and Schools District Fiscal Accountability Act. And before that, before PA 4, there was PA 72, which was a financial manager act, which allowed the state to impose a financial manager to come in and deal with the financial issues of municipalities or school boards. And the Detroit School Board has been under financial managers for decades now. And before Governor Schneider took office, the financial manager at the time, blanking on his name, but not only what they do, they come in and they cut contracts, they cut benefits, they fire employees, and then they bring in contract workers. But the financial manager at that point also started to tweak with curriculum, and the teachers union went to court and said that was beyond their mandate, and the union won. And so PA 4, put in by Governor Schneider, is really seen as a way to increase the authority of financial managers. And the name actually changes. They're no longer called a financial manager, but they're called an emergency manager at that time. So these appointees, they could cancel collective bargaining agreements and other contracts. They could disregard existing local ordinances, create new laws, sell off public assets, eliminate the salaries of local elected officials. They also decided how much authority, if any, duly elected officials could retain. So Michigan citizens launched a public backlash to PA 4. And together the individuals and organizations worked collectively, and they got signatures, 225,885 signatures, which are 65,000 more signatures that they need. They needed 161 signatures to place PA 4 on the referendum, on a ballot. People got together and they voted PA 4 down in the state. During the same time, Governor Schneider got together with Kevin Orr and Jones Day, which is the law firm that Kevin Orr works for or is a partner of, and rewrote PA 4 and named it PA 436. They put appropriations in the bill, which made it referendum proof. And so governor comes back in a lame duck session of the cabinet and passes this law, PA 436. Kirk Guyette of the Michigan ACLU says, no state in the country has had a law that puts so much power in the hands of just one person. Deborah Taylor, who also works for We the People of Detroit, argues that this policy is harsh. It's becoming more harsh and more repressive and regressive as time has gone on. To give you a sense to give you a sense of how this is applied. Again, this is supposedly applied to places that were insolvent. If you weren't able to balance your city budgets, an emergency manager was put in place. But if you look at the cities that were the cities and the school districts, SD stands for school districts, that were placed under emergency management, they are overwhelmingly, with the exception of 2, communities of color. And over the decade that communities have lived, more than 50% of African American Michiganders have lived under some form of emergency management law. So the use of emergency management law in particular, it cedes the authority of local government to a governor appointed emergency manager, effectively removing any sort of local control. In the past decade, over half of the African Americans in Michigan, that's compared to only 2% of whites, have lived under emergency management of some sort. Similarly, Hispanic and Latinos are also overrepresented in 5 of the 9 cities under emergency management law. And what's really interesting, if you look at some of the communities, white communities, like say Lapeer, Michigan, that were also financially insolvent, they were not placed under emergency management law. So this is clearly a way to financially discipline communities of color in the state. So another way to think about, so here's where the kind of water politics plays out. Much of what transpires under Governor Schneider is really about not only disciplining financially the cities of Flint and Detroit, right? And see if I can, here's Flint right here, and Detroit, of course, is down here. But also about removing their control over the water that flows in Southeast Michigan. The Detroit Sewer and Water Department is the 3rd largest water infrastructure in the country. It has and continues, or had up until the bankruptcy, was controlled by Black leadership, feeding white suburban places. And white suburban leadership has never liked that. The same thing with Flint. Flint, water is pumped to Flint, and then it goes out to the Genesee County and to Lapeer County. And the counties that surround Flint have never liked that either. So PA 436 and the emergency management law provided the legal theory and clout to steer the city of Detroit towards the largest municipal bankruptcy in U.S. history, but also to force the city of Flint off of the Detroit sewer and water system and to build its own pipeline, the Carragandi water pipeline here in red. This is all part of a master plan to transform ownership and control of water infrastructure in the region from Black cities to rural white suburbs, a regional and racial struggle that has been going on for decades in Southeast Michigan. So actually, this is someone saying, really all this was about was a grand plan to get a certain amount of water to the middle of the state. Flint had 4 emergency managers placed. And so I want to kind of emphasize what that means. This is the person on the left is Ed Kurtz. Michael Brown, Darnell Early, and Gerald Ambrose. One thing I can tell you is neither of these four are financial wizards. They may have balanced the budget, the annual budget, but under these four emergency managers, the deficit in Flint actually increased. And they would come in and they would sell off the waste contractors. They would come off and sell off all sorts of city assets and buildings. They sold off downtown buildings for $1 in some cases. They even auctioned off the Christmas Santa at City Hall. I mean, these folks came in and really just didn't really understand accounting. Everyone I've talked to was overwhelming and said, these folks just were not there to balance the books. They were there for something else. And they used kind of the executive power to not only cancel city agreements and contracts, but to sell off public assets of the indebted city. And if anyone who knows basic accounting, if you want to sort of balance the books, you maintain assets, because that's what's going to actually give you leverage moving forward. But the KWA, the Karagandhi Water Project, was conservatively estimated to cost $285 million. And Flint was responsible for 30% of this expected cost. And from the beginning, all four of these emergency managers tried to rationalize a reason to commit this sort of bankrupted city, Flint, to paying $85 million for a new water contract. It never made financial sense. Right? It really was an attempt to save money, right? In an attempt to save money, while the Karagandhi water pipeline in an attempt to save money whilst the Karagandhi pipeline was being built, was the reason that Flint went to the river, right? Was the reason that it stopped its buying water from Detroit and started to buy and started to use the Flint water, the Flint River, and treat it themselves. Going back to Detroit and its restructuring. In July 2013, Kevin Orr declared bankruptcy on behalf of the city of Detroit, giving the banks kind of direct control over the city's finances. Kevin Orr is a partner for Jones Day. Jones Day is the third largest law firm in the world. It's got about 2,400 employees, gross revenues of about $1.6 billion. What it did is it forfeited billions of dollars in pensions. Schools were closed. What he did, city assets were sold off on the cheap, and about 150,000 families lost their homes in foreclosures in Detroit from 205 to 210. On the left is Deborah Taylor. On the right is Monica Lewis Patrick. This is sort of how emergency management and how financial disciplining gets done. You hire a friend to become the emergency manager, and his company runs the restructuring council. Jones Day represents most of the global banks, which hold the city of Detroit's total debt, which was at that time over $12.9 billion. Jones Day also represented some of the biggest media and media-related companies in the country. That includes includes the Detroit Free Press. Right? So what you will find, Monica Lewis Patrick tells me, is it's really difficult to get an opposing view to much of the kind of mainstream media that's going on around Detroit bankruptcy in particular, because they own the Detroit Free Press, they own channels 2, 4, and 7, the news media, right? And it's really hard in the city to get any sort of traction on any sort of alternative narrative to what's going on. So another piece that comes out in terms of the bankruptcy of these cities is the advancement or questionable jurisprudence. So Ellen and Merritt are two bankruptcy lawyers that actually work for Jones Day. And they write a treatise called, or a theory called Pensions and Chapter 9. Can municipalities use bankruptcy to solve their pension woes? Right? Gets published in the kind of Emory Bankruptcy Development Journal. And they put forth a problem, right? They argue that the single kind of largest problem facing municipalities today is the dramatic and growing shortfall in public pension funds. So it's not the tax cuts of Schneider, right? It's not the cutting of revenue sharing, but it's these really dramatic and growing public pension funds, right? The problem, we are told, right, is that public service workers' benefits, teachers, firefighters, today what we would call first responders, right, have really aggressively negotiated by collective bargaining units, and they've mismanaged by elected officials. And we're not simply, that they're just now too expensive, and they need to be right-sized. And it really is this kind of gross oversimplification, and it speaks really volumes to, in which this political theory has kind of morphed into kind of what I would call pure ideological kind of gobbledygook. There's no mention, of course, of the role of the state in kind of creating these kind of financial distresses at the local level. Also very important, there's no mention of race. But what comes out is, it's very clear, kind of colorblind rhetoric, that we're talking about the excessive benefits of pensioners in cities of color. So they never allude to the fact that a large percentage of those who are about to lose their pensions, if they're correct with this financial theory, were Black, middle-class people, many of whom had worked their entire life to secure some form of base retirement income. Many of them first generation in the history of kind of Black wage labor to be eligible to actually earn retirement income. They didn't have to, really. Conversely, there's also no mention of the removal of state revenue sharing, white flight, disinvestment, or any of other kind of myriad of other racialized forms of dispossession and segregation in their theory of municipal bankruptcy. So they argue that a real workable solution to the overwhelming and seemingly unassailable pension obligations of many municipal debtors is Chapter 9. The legal question was really, does financial bankruptcy law have precedent over public employee benefit protections, which is embedded in the Michigan Constitution? They filed for Chapter 9 bankruptcy, and the court, the federal bankruptcy court judge, said yes, it does. So they were able to push the law, in this case, to argue that federal bankruptcy Chapter 9 has precedent over public employee pension protections under state constitutions. And this is really big in terms of kind of advancing or securing, I would say, the municipal bond markets for banks. So the plan to eliminate the debt in Detroit, the plan is to eliminate about $7 billion in debt. And it does that by cutting the pensions of 23,000 Detroit retirees. Of the $7 billion, about 80% of them are taken from retirement benefits. Kirk Guyette writes, whatever their past faults, municipal employees and retirees didn't cause people and businesses to flee the city, had nothing to do with the predatory lending and mortgage industry Ponzi schemes and the resulting foreclosure tsunami that happened to push cities like Flint and Detroit and hundreds of other cities across the country towards bankruptcy. Yet, through this legal jurisprudence, they are clearly paying the cost. So what happens as a result of the bankruptcy and emergency management in both in Flint and Detroit is the bankruptcy amount of the Detroit Water and Sewer Department was about $6.4 billion. But none of that debt gets reduced into bankruptcy. What does happen is that the ownership of the Detroit Water and Sewer Department gets shifted to the suburban white communities of Wayne, Oakland, and Macomb. Before, Detroit Water Sewer was controlled by the city with minority vote by the suburbs. Under the reconstruction through the bankruptcy, the Detroit water system, now called the Great Lakes Water Authority, moves to suburban ownership and control. All during this time, there are pictures in the newspaper and other places that cast the cities, both of Detroit and Flint, as cities with poor leadership and dubious intentions. And so here you have Mayor Coleman Alexander Young, right, sitting on the tap of the Detroit Water Department, ready to close it off to white suburbanites. And here you have, again, the same mayor with a shotgun sitting on 8 Mile, which is the border, protecting the water system. Other kind of colorblind vocabulary that was used during this time to bankrupt Detroit and move and to impose 4 emergency managers in Flint. Here's a health and human services person who argues, you know, it's just a few IQ points. It's not the end of the world. Right? So here again, you get this idea that, you know, it's people of color, you know, it's Black people, African Americans in Flint, and really, does it really matter? Right? Quite often, a lot of the justification for imposing emergency managers was because there was a culture of corruption in many of these cities, which clearly is not true. Kevin Orr, before he takes over the emergency manager role in Detroit, says, you know, for a long time, the city was dumb, lazy, happy, and rich. Again, very similar discourse to Governor Schneider, but not sort of as bombastic as, let's say, L. Brooks Patterson, who is the chief executive officer of Oakland. And he argues, you know, I made a prediction a long time ago, and it's come to pass. What we're going to do is turn Detroit into an Indian reservation, where we can herd all the Indians into the city, build a fence around it, and then throw in blankets and corn. Again, I go back to this idea of racialized austerity, but also this idea of a plan. What happened in Detroit and what happened in Flint was part of a large master plan by particular white elites in the state. So a couple of slides, I'm going to conclude here. The human consequences, of these water wars are hidden from most of us. Poisoned water and water shutoffs cleave families apart. As some people relocate and are seeking temporary relief and shelter elsewhere, days are lost from working and children miss school days as families kind of navigate new environments or try to figure out how to survive in these forgotten places. Entire swaths of Detroit and Flint are left abandoned without water, leaving people unable to cook, unable to clean, anxious about bathing and showering, and terrified to nurse their children. Living precariously from one bottled water to the next means facing a rising tide of personal despair and indignity, and having to ask for help and handouts from family, friends, and even charity. For many, mortgage foreclosures have led to homelessness, as entire generations of accumulated Black and brown wealth have been forcibly taken, and homeless and homeowners have been put out on the streets. what we're seeing as a result of this austerity are multiple and intersecting environmental injustices: health, family, economic, and political. And that's occurred as a result of kind of this, what I would call neoliberal statecraft, determined to force large-scale urban redevelopment and resegregation on citizens in the name of fiscal responsibility and austerity. This is the last slide, and I'll conclude after this. Water is critical in maintaining a safe home. You can't live in a house without it. If your gas gets cut off or your electricity is not working, you might go without internet, or you might have to put on a blanket to keep warm. If your cable gets disconnected, you stop watching TV or you get off of Zoom. If your water gets cut off, you can be evicted. You can have your children taken from you by Health and Human Services. If your water is poisoned, your house is lethal. In languages all over the world, home encompasses not just a place of shelter, but also warmth, safety, family. It's where stories are told and shared. It's the primary basis of life. It's where stories and meals are shared. Housing stability leads to employment stability. Housing instability can downgrade a children's health, ability to learn, capacity to cultivate peer groups, and a sense of worth. In many ways, the home is the social determinant of health. And all of this suffering is shameful in both the cases of Flint and Detroit, and in so many other harms done to people of color, it was completely unnecessary. The decision to poison people and turn off their water was also a collective decision made by government officials, political elites, interests, charity groups, think tanks, and their special interests. They were done by government officials and agency staff, people trusted with providing the public good, as well as those looking to make a profit. All of this environmental devastation, suffering, and loss of life was easily rationalized, both in Flint and Detroit, because these are Black cities. I'll stop there and take questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Michael. That was a fantastic talk. So yeah, if anybody has questions, please raise your electronic hands or just unmute yourself and break in. So I'll start. Thank you so much. There's so much here to talk about. One thing that I really appreciated, one of the sort of central things you did was reframing this from being about neglect to being about this concerted effort of white political and legal elites to create this devastation in the name of sort of pushing this austerity agenda. I'd like to hear a little bit more about the degree to which you might see white publics as being potentially complicit in this mission, this racialized austerity. Like, to what degree do you see austerity functioning as a sort of racial dog whistle that white publics are potentially supporting to maintain their own sort of positions of privilege?
Yeah, that's a great question. This is, if the talk comes off kind of a little bit cacophonous, it is really because it's so hard to put this the hardest thing for me in writing this has been, how do you write a story that kind of connects all of this, holds an intention, and makes sense? And the more work I do, the kind of longer these kind of threads and connections and alliances and networks become. So it's hard to kind of try to weave it back together again. But so an example of there's a tremendous amount of antagonism in Michigan, and I may not have stressed this enough, between the cities, which are like Benton Harbor and Flint and Detroit and other, Hamtramck and other Black cities, and the suburban areas. And I think to some extent, I mean, it's a great thing for someone in in Oakland County to say, oh, I haven't been to Detroit in 10 years. I haven't been down 11 miles to the city to go to the Detroit Arts in 10 years. That's a great thing. And I think that there is a tremendous amount of almost knowing, that they're part of this larger kind of this movement, right? They want to wrestle control, the sort of last kind of fringes of control away from Detroit and Flint, the rural areas. So, and a lot of the rural areas, the biggest growth in Southeast Michigan is the housing market. Up until the housing crisis, it really was the housing market. And housing is determined around where water flows, first and foremost. So much of the southeast townships of Genesee County, much of kind of northern Oakland County, where a lot of this build out is happening, need water. And the cities or the counties of Macomb and sort of the cities of Lapeer and Fenton and all these other townships outside have been arguing with Flint and Detroit to have their own water really for decades now. And so I think the white publics, not necessarily, I'm not talking about white publics here, but sort of white folks who are in political office have been putting in Senate bills almost every second or third year to change the ownership of the water systems in these towns. And so I think there's no hiding really in many ways that the interests of suburban whites in Southeast Michigan around their kind of active engagement in wrestling water infrastructure in particular away from these cities.
Thank you. I know that we're a little over time already, but if anybody has any sort of one last question to take us away.
Sorry for going so long.
No, it was a great talk, but yeah. Any last questions? All right. Well, it's been, quite a week. Thank you so much for taking us out here, Michael.
You're quite welcome. Thank you for joining me. I understand there's lots of distractions, but thank you.
Thank you so much. Bye, everybody.
Bye.